Hey YouTube, it's Jay. Hey, so wanted to do a quick video today. There's a question that just keeps popping up. I've seen it 1,000 times, and it generally runs something like this. I'm a new player. I've been playing for 3 months. I've been playing for 6 months. I've been playing for a year, and I want to get a queue. I want to get a queue that's decent but not very expensive. And so, what should I get? And there are a few things about queues to understand. The first one is that a queue by itself does not make you more accurate. It does not give you more spin. It may give you somewhat lower deflection. There's no such thing as zero deflection shafts. If they say zero deflection, they're lying. But there are very low deflection shafts, especially with like Mez and Q-Tech and Predator, and Mucci too, for that matter. But they don't give you any extra spin. A queue by itself is not going to make you a better player. The reason you buy a queue is for consistency, so that when you go from place to place, you always have the same queue that you're playing with, so your game doesn't have to adapt to a variable every time you move from one place to another. So that kind of leads me to the second part of this, which is if you're buying a queue for consistency, then the most important thing about the queue is that it feels right to you. Okay? I can't tell you which queue is the best one for you to buy. Nobody can. I can suggest some brands, and there are some good ones out there that are on the inexpensive side. There's Lucky by McDermott. Okay, McDermott is the queue that I use. Now, obviously, my queue is not a cheap queue, but McDermott has a lower brand, and they use a little bit less quality materials. They're let's just say they're given a little less love in the manufacturing process, but they're decent queues. Okay, and they're good beginner queues, and they're fairly inexpensive. The other thing to know about queues is that in a given line of queues, if you have a line of queues from a manufacturer, the lowest, cheapest, most inexpensive queue in that line plays exactly the same as the most expensive queue in that line, as long as they have the same shafts and same shaft and tip. Okay? You can cut down on cost by going with a wood shaft instead of a low deflection carbon fiber shaft. But with the same shaft and tip, the lowest level queue in a line and the highest level queue in a line play exactly the same. They are the same queue. The difference is the artwork and the materials used in the queue. So for example, with this, the queue that I shoot with, that you've seen me shoot with, is an RS11. It's a McDermott RS11. Okay, so back in the 90s, it's from 1996, by the way. It's a 28-year-old queue. In the 1990s, McDermott was up against some other production queues that were more expensive. Joss, Sean, the Predator series, and they came out with this line of more expensive queues that used better materials, better workmanship, what have you. And this, there were 12 of them in the series. There was an RS1 all the way through RS12. Okay, and this is the RS11. Now, the difference between the RS1 and my RS11 is the artwork and the woods used in it. So this has Cocobolo points, has walnut with Cocobolo down in the butt cap here. It has Coca-Cola inlays in the rings with silver rings. So all those are silver. And so, but the RS1 and the RS11 hit exactly identical, and the difference in price, mine was with the second shaft was $900, I think, and an RS1 with the second shaft was like $500. So I mean, there was a pretty big price difference, but it was all because of the workmanship. These inlays, so these are actually inlaid in the points. It's not a decal; those are actually inlaid in the points. Things like that, you know, with an intricate design in the points. And I don't know if you can see it, but it's kind of a wavy fish kind of thing with a point on the end of it. That takes work to do those inlays and get them right. And I'm sure that they destroyed a bunch of the inlays trying to machine them in. And so a cue like this has a lot that goes into it in terms of craftsmanship, but as far as the actual play of the cue, it's exactly identical. Okay, so where I'm going with that is that if you were to get the very plain Mucci that I think it's like $220 or something like that now, that cue will shoot just as good as any of the Muccis in the same line with it, assuming the same shaft and the same tip. So when we talk about how do we get a cheap cue, we look at the value brands like Lucky from McDermott and the one that we're going to review here, which is from Action. And you pick the one that feels the best to you that you can afford. Okay, so if I was a brand new player, I don't want to invest a lot in a cue if I've just taken up the game, because the fact is most people, they take up the game, they play it for a while, and then it drops off and they go away and go back to their life, right? And it's really easy to get caught up in that fanaticism and buy an expensive cue, use it for a month or two, and then you stop playing the game and it just sits collecting dust. And it's very easy to do that. So when you're talking about a first cue or a first, call it a first custom cue, it's not actually custom, they're production, but when you get to the point where you're doing your first cue that's not a Kmart special, for those of you that remember Kmart, and you're going to step up above $20 for your cue, well, it really comes down to find one that you really like that's the bottom end of the spectrum for that line of cues. And and when you're doing that, don't pay for appearance when you first buy a cue. Make sure you're going to get into the game. You can always buy a cue later that's pretty and has all the ornamentation on it. My first cue was a Mucci Blondie. Okay, it was a Mucci cue, just like my cue here, the one that you see me breaking with. It was exactly like this cue, except it didn't have any points, and the wrap was a light yellow, and the rings were, I don't remember what the rings were like, but they weren't like any, there was no decoration to the rings, okay? And at the time, that was in the 80s, it cost me $110, I think. Then I stepped up and this became my cue, and that Blondie became my breaking cue. This cue is a 1984, it's a Mucci MO4.5 from about 1984, 84 or 86. And 1986, I think, is when I got it. So this cue is almost 40 years old, by the way, and I break with it every game. The point and I paid $225 for this one, and then I had a Mucci Gambler, which is the one that has the cards and the dice around the butt. It's black with red and white points. The Mucci Gambler was my third cue, and that was a, I don't know, $600 cue at the time. And then I stepped up from that to this one, and I've never looked back, because this one is perfect for me. The balance is exactly right, the feel is right, the feedback is perfect. I've had people who have very expensive cues that have hit with it and offered to trade me their very expensive cues for that cue. And when I say very expensive, I'm talking about ones that cost thousands and thousands of dollars. And they've offered to trade me. This cue's perfect for you. But my point there is, you don't start here. Okay, this cue today is worth like I've been offered between $2,500 and $3,000 for it a few times. You don't start with the $2,000 or $3,000 cue. You don't start with a $1,000 cue. Start with a basic cue. Don't focus on the appearance. Focus on how it plays. Okay, now, where am I going with this? Why am I bringing all this up? Okay, so my cue, as I said, is very old, and the joint on mine is metal on wood. Okay, so the pin is metal, the socket is just wood. There's no insert or anything. It's metal on wood. The screw actually screws into the wood. It's gotten old, like I am, and so many of us are. And the threads in this shaft, I was putting a tip on it, and the threads in this shaft, basically they crumbled. That's the only way to describe it. They literally just crumbled. And so I've got to send my cue off to get it repaired. They're gonna drill out the old threads, they're gonna put wood glue and a dowel in there, and then they're gonna rethread it in the hardwood dowel. Which means my cue's gonna be gone for a little while. It's not gonna take that long. He said 2 to 3 weeks plus shipping, so figure a month. But I can't be without a cue for a month. Even as little as I'm playing, I still need to be able to play. So I wanted to go ahead and I wanted to get a replacement cue to use while that's gone, but I didn't want to spend a lot of money on it. So I wanted a cheap cue. So I ordered an Action Sneaky Pete from Pool Dog. By the way, very much like Pool Dog. Their guarantee, second to none. You don't like it, you send it back. They give you credit for another one. So very much like their guarantee, no questions asked. They're really good about it. This just came in. I have not opened it yet. I want to take just a second to talk about what a Sneaky Pete is, and maybe give you a little history about it. So back in the day, when hustlers roamed the earth in the wild, not like they don't still roam in the wild, it was a different world. The hustlers back then could get away with it because they didn't have things like facial recognition and image search. You couldn't take a picture of somebody and go look up their Fargo rate. Okay, you take a picture of somebody, you run it through Google image search, it comes back, it tells you who the person is, and then you run it through Fargo rate to find out what their rate is, which that's a whole other conversation. It wasn't like that. And so road players, people who made a living, going out and traveling the country and hitting all the dive bars and hitting the pool halls and playing for money and hustling, wouldn't walk in with a cue like mine. You walk in with a cue like mine or one of these expensive cues, and it says one of two things about you. It either says you got a lot of money and you're stupid, and you're a fish and they should come get your money from you, or you're good enough to not worry about those things any longer. Okay, that's what an expensive cue says about you. You're either have a lot of money and it'll be easy to take all your money, or you're good enough to back it up. One of the two. And so a road player doesn't want to carry that with them, because it tells everybody, hey, I'm good enough to back this up, right? People don't drive around the country playing for money and have an expensive cue and not be good enough to back up why they have that cue. So what they would do is they would get a cue that looked just like a house cue. As a matter of fact, many times they would take an actual house cue and they would cut it in half. They would put the shaft, they would take the shaft and machine it to exactly what they wanted it to be, put a pin on the base, and they would have a house cue that the two pieces would screw together in a two-piece cue. They'd put their own ferrule, their own tip on it, right? And so when it was put together, you could not tell the difference between it and a cue that was hanging on the wall in the bar or the pool hall that they were playing at. They look exactly like the ones in the bar or the pool hall. And it was a way to disguise that they had an advantage. Okay? They would walk in and not really super hide it, but they'd have just the cue, no case. When they walk in, they'd have the cue up by their arm so you couldn't really see it that well. Or they'd walk in without a cue, and sometime along the way they would suddenly have a cue, and it would seem like they had a cue off the wall of the bar. Some of them would even go ahead of time and put their cue, their Sneaky Pete, on like a rack back in the very far corner where nobody would go. Everybody would pick the ones that were close. And so they'd actually put it way back in the back. And they would walk in without a cue, and then they'd go and they'd walk to that back rack and start looking at the cues and maybe pick one or two up and feel them and what have you and put them back, and then pick up their own cue and, okay, this one feels good, and they go to the table, right? Okay, so that was a way to trick people. Well, today you can still get Sneaky Petes. Okay, they're still made by several companies, but most of them have ornamentation on them. So if you look at this one would be considered a Sneaky Pete today. But I can look at that, and in 2 seconds I can tell you that that is not a one-piece bar cue. It's got rings. It's got this little fancy thing around the base. The points are outlined. This is not a bar cue. You'll never mistake that for a bar cue, right? So even though they call it a Sneaky Pete today, it's not. And by the way, this is actually a really good cue. It's about a $600 cue. It is. It's machined from an old Brunswick cue from, I think, the 1950s, if I remember right. And the cue maker took an old cue from the old Brunswick cue from the 1950s, cut it in half, put a pin in it, made some horn rings. By the way, horn is horrible material for rings. Added this little decoration around the base. Added this butt cap here that's all black instead of having it be wood all the way down. And it shoots good. And the only reason that I don't want to use that in the middle term, while I'm waiting for my cue to come back, is that this is a conical taper or straight taper. I don't like straight tapers. I'm short, so quite often you'll see me all the way back here at the end of my stroke. And when I am, this cue's too fat here. Okay, I prefer Pro Taper, which is one that's kind of, it's just flat all the way to about here, and then it widens out. Okay, and you can see that on mine. So if you look at mine, it's roughly the same width all the way down till you get right here, and then it starts to spread out a little bit. Okay, this is a Pro Taper. That one's what's called a conical taper. And you can see the difference when I set them next to each other. I prefer a Pro Taper. Okay, so you can see that this one is getting fatter and fatter and fatter the further up the shaft you go. Where mine is staying straight until here, and then it just flares out into that. So I don't want to use this cue as my temporary cue because I don't like that taper. The cue plays fine. Matter of fact, the day that I got it, I played several games against Tommy Kennedy. In the very first game, I broke and ran with that cue. So the first game it ever played was break and run. So instead, what I did is I said, you know what, I'll kill two birds with one stone. I'll get a cue I can use, and I have not unpacked this. I just cut the tape on the box. I haven't even looked at it yet. I will get an Action Sneaky Pete from Pool Dog. This cue costs $107 shipped. Okay, and we're gonna take it, we're gonna look at it, and we're going to try it out and see how it plays, and I'll give you my opinion on it. It's brand new. I did nothing custom. It's got the same ferrule that comes with it. It's got the same tip that comes with it. I didn't replace out the tip or anything. This is the standard stock cue. It's $107 from Pool Dog. And I'm going to keep it so I can ship my cues and be durable. That sounds like fun. Now, I'm not really concerned about hiding who I am, so I went with the black forearm. So this is black instead of brown. If I was trying to hide it, I would get a brown one. But you can see there's no rings. There's no fanciness around the cue. It's just black points. And when you put it together, you should not be able to tell the difference between this and a cue hanging on the wall in the local bar, assuming it was the brown one. And so you see when it's together, it looks just like a bar cue. That's a Sneaky Pete. This is a real Sneaky Pete. Okay, now the only thing that's not a Sneaky Pete about it is they stuck their name down at the bottom, and you've got a different kind of bumper than most have. But you have to look kind of close to realize that that's not a house cue. The lacquer doesn't really match up as well as I'd like. I'd like for this to be indistinguishable so you don't see where it screws together. But for an inexpensive cue, we're going to see how this plays and see that this $100 cue, and I'm going to play with my regular one too. So that tip, it did come shaped. Doesn't look like it's layered. It might be, but it doesn't look like it. It looks like a standard like bullhide tip. So on this Action cue, I've been playing with it for a couple of days, and the tip that comes on it spreads a lot. It mushrooms. Okay, so that means that the tip is coming past the ferrule out on the sides. It's getting shorter and wider with the hits. So if you stay with the stock tip, And I know that this lighting seems even worse than it was. I replaced the diffusers in my light to get it more concentrated on the table, which makes the area around it darker than it was. But if you look at the tip, if you use any tip, you should always burnish it before you shape it, okay? And I'm going to show you how to do that here. I'm going to use a Willard shaper. That's the one that I generally use. A little saucer-shaped shaper. It's got a gauge on it to show you that you can use. You set it on top and look through it to see if you see any light around the edge. That means the tip's not shaped yet. So you keep shaping until there's no light. Let me show you how to burnish it. Before you shape it, every time you should always burnish the sides of your tip just to keep it from spreading, regardless of what tip you have. You don't need a fancy tool to do that. With this tip, I would say you really need to burnish it before you play every time, because it does spread more than I would like. In fact, it's spread right now, and I've only played maybe an hour with it since I took it down and trimmed it. I trimmed it on the lathe, and then I burnished it. Still spread a little bit, not as much. As it firms up, it'll spread less and less, but still burnish it. Okay, so how do you burnish a tip? Well, all you need to burnish a tip is a dollar bill. Okay? You're going to take the dollar bill, you're going to fold it in half long ways, and then you're going to fold it in half again so that you have a quarter, so that it's about a quarter of the size that it was. All right? So you fold it, and you fold it a second time. You're going to take the tip. You're going to take a little bit of saliva. Yes, you're going to spit on the tip. Okay? A little bit of moisture around the edge. You'll see that it'll get a darker color. That tells you that'll show you any spots you missed. Once the whole thing is dark all the way around the edge, you take your dollar bill, you fold it around the tip, grip it tightly, and then twist. And I'm going to do this over here because it's easier if the cue is standing up to do it. And they do this on the lathe, by the way, when they put a new tip on. But you should reapply this every time you shape just to keep it from mushrooming. And the outside will get hard and shiny from the heat of the friction from the dollar bill. Okay? It gets hard and shiny. Hear that squeak? You want to hear that. If it's not doing that, it's not burnished. Once it's doing that, you'll have a nice, you can see it's darker than it was, and it's shinier than it was. This one doesn't really get shiny, but if you do it with other tips, you'll find that the edges actually get really shiny. And it's very clear with a layered tip to see the layers in the tip. Okay? So every time you shape it, and with the tip that comes on these sneaky peaks, you should do it every time. Now, the reason you do it before you shape it is that some of this is going to get around the upper side of the edge. Okay, I don't know if you can see it, but there's like a dark ring around the edge. That will cause you to miscue, okay? So anytime you burnish it, you always want to rough up that outside edge. You always want to at least give it a few turns with the shaper. Even if it's already shaped like this one is, you still give it a few turns with the shaper just to knock that that hard edge off around the tip. Okay, so that's how you burnish tip. Other than that, the cue has been playing just fine.